I was a history major in college. What you hear when you hear history, this is what most people hear, is dry, dusty, and a whole lot of dates. But it's not really the way history is. History is actually very, very exciting. The Old Testament of the Bible covers, from Abraham until the end of the Old Testament, covers roughly 1,500 years, give or take a little bit, depending on exactly where you slot some things in. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis are creation to Abraham, and then the whole rest of the Old Testament. Now, 1,500 years is a lot of time to have a lot of stuff happen. That means potentially a lot of dry, a lot of dusty, and a lot of dates. I have good news for you. To understand the history of the Old Testament, you only need to know 3 dates. And not really even dates, just years. There are just 3 years that you need to know: 922 BC, 722 BC, and 586 BC. Now, these dates are so important that if you're one of the students in my Old Testament introduction class, you would see them coming on a test. Matter of fact, more than one test. So next Sunday. So let's talk about why these 3 dates are so vital and so critical and so important. We have 12 tribes that leave Egypt. These 12 tribes are eventually unified under one king named Saul. David and Solomon reign over these 12 tribes. They're called Israel. That's the name of the nation. However, upon the death of Solomon, his son, Rehoboam, doesn't follow the wise course advised by the elders, but instead decides to take the foolish advice of his running buddies. And as a result, we have a civil war and the kingdom splits. So in 922, we no longer have one nation, we now have 2. 10 tribes that are called Israel. Yep, that's confusing. All 12 are called Israel. Then after the split, only the 10 in the north are called Israel. I didn't say it was easy. I just said it's not as difficult as you might think. So the 10 tribes in the north are now Israel. That's after 922. Matter of fact, we have a map. I think there it is. The green splotch is the 10 northern tribes, and the purple splotch is the southern 2 tribes known as Judah. So after 922 BC, we have 2 nations. Now, the capitals of these are Jerusalem and Samaria. So I believe we got them circled here. Yep, so Samaria is the capital north, and then Jerusalem is the capital still in the south. So Samaria is the capital. In 722 BC, the city of Samaria is destroyed, and the northern kingdom is no more. They're gone. We're just left with the southern tribe, Judah. Then in 586 BC, the southern kingdom is destroyed. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed. Okay, so 722 they split, 922 they split, 722 the north is gone, 586 the south is gone. The entire Old Testament hangs on those 3 dates. That's not bad. I mean, it's not like, there's hundreds of dates that matter. Those are the 3 dates. The entire Old Testament history hangs on those 3 dates. And you can understand that. We have a few very important dates, like in American history. Like, what's probably the most important date in the history of the United States? Wow. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. Well, for the first time in history, there'd be a nation that would experiment with actually letting people be free. We didn't like the experiment, so we are no longer, but for a while we were. So that's the most important date. The second most important date in the history of the United States is May 26, 1964. It's my birthday. Of course. Now, that's not the second most important date for my wife. Hers would be July the 20th, 1985, because that's the day she married me. Do y'all feel that badly for her? So they're like important personal dates, but important like history dates for like everybody. So this morning, I want us to look at 2 Kings chapter 17, because we're going to read what happened in 722 BC when the northern kingdom was destroyed. So if you turn to 2 Kings chapter 17, we're going to read the catastrophic destruction of the 10 tribes in the north. Now, unfortunately, there's a failure to learn from their own history, as we often fail to learn from the history of others. So he starts off by just describing the fact that they continue making poor decisions all the way to the end. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria, that's the capital, over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. Now, for those of you who like specific historical details, this is actually Shalmaneser the fifth, but the Bible doesn't use numbers after it just gives names, and so, but we know which one it is. So Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Now, this king is like it's interesting that all the kings, every single king, without exception, all the kings of the northern kingdom, all of them do evil in the sight of the Lord. All of them. But Hoshea is not as bad as them. You know, why is he not as bad as them? The reason he's not as bad as them is because there's no reference to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Oh, okay. So here's what happened. In 922, when they split, Jeroboam, who became the king of the 10 northern tribes, said, man, I can't have people going back to Jerusalem for like the festivals, like for Passover and stuff. They might decide they want to rejoin with them, and then they'll kill me. So he set up a couple of rival sanctuaries, one at Dan in the north and one at Bethel in the south. And in each of those he put a golden bull or golden calf. And the people went to them and worshiped. And every king after Jeroboam continued to allow the people and encourage them to worship at those two places to the 2 golden calves. So why does Hoshea not do that? Well, we'd like to think that maybe he was not quite as bad as the others, but that's probably not the reason. At this point, the Assyrians are in charge of the land, and people just weren't as free to move around as they were before, and so they weren't able to get to Dan to worship. So it's probably more practical than it was theological. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd want God to ever look at me and say, look, you're not as bad as everybody else, but dude, you're still bad. Like some people, they just want to hear, well, you're not as bad as your brother. But it's not like this work that way with God. So that's Hoshea. He's evil. He's just like all the rest of them before him. Not quite as bad because they don't do the Jeroboam and son of Nebat sins. So against him, Shalmaneser comes up, and Hoshea becomes his vassal and paid him tribute. And what does that mean? Well, in the ancient world, they would come in and beat you up. And then they would tell you, as long as you pay me every year, I won't come back and beat you up again. If you don't pay me, I won't come beat you up. In other words, it's literally the bully on the playground. If you give me your milk money, I won't beat you up. And then that's what they did. So he paid him every year to not come in and beat him up. But then at some point, he decides he's going to get Egypt to help him. So he goes to So, who's the Pharaoh of Egypt, says, hey, would you help us? And apparently Pharaoh said yes, but he never comes to render any eggs. He really don't care about them. They don't have much to offer him. And so they just quit paying. Just quit paying. And so Shalmaneser does exactly what he said. He comes in and he captures the king, Hoshea, and then he comes up to besiege the city 3 years. Now, besiege doesn't mean they were attacking the city. That's not how it worked. They actually just surrounded the city and wouldn't let any food get in, and the goal was to starve people out. That's why they do it for 3 years, because there were stockpiles of food. And so they surround the city for 3 years, and eventually the people give in because they're starving, and the Assyrians capture it, and then they spread the people all over the place. So I want to note something that's important, and then I want to note something that is interesting. So let's start with the interesting first. In verse 6, it says they spread them out to all these places. Okay, these have traditionally been called the lost tribes of Israel. So have you ever heard somebody say, yeah, what about the lost tribes of Israel? This is what they're talking about. 2 Kings 17:6, that these tribes are spread out all over the Assyrian Empire. And just to make sure you're aware, you're not one of them. But that's where that phrase, the lost tribes of Israel, if you ever heard that, someone mention that phrase, it comes right out of this. But here's the important thing. The important thing is, from the get-go, Israel was told, trust in me. Trust in me. Over and over again, God says, trust in me. But that's not what the king does. He doesn't trust in God. He doesn't go to the Lord to look for security. He goes to Egypt. He goes to the wrong place. In other words, throughout their history, They have continually not done what they were supposed to do. They keep on trying to fix things the wrong way. So let me show you kind of how this works. How many of you would like to walk in the house and see this? Oh, that's nothing. Check this one out. Yes. What? You see mold, I see penicillin. Look at this one. I like this one right here. Now, what you do if you walk in and you find mold in the walls in your house is you paint them. You paint them. And when the mold shows up again, you paint them again. And eventually, if you have to, you paint them a different color. That's what you do. That's not the right way to go about it. I know, and that's the problem here. That's why we get these verses to kind of set the chapter. The problem is throughout their history, they've tried to fix their situation the wrong way. They've tried to fix it by trusting in some other nation rather than trusting in the God of their nation. They don't trust the Lord, and that's the problem. And they just continue to do this all the way to the end. So what is the reason then for God's judgment to come? Well, look what he says in verse 7. And this occurred because... Here's the reason this catastrophic judgment came. Because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. So the cause is that they have gone after the gods of the nations. Now, if you go after the gods of the nation, what's going to happen? You're going to go after the ways of the nations. So now look at verse 8. And they walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. So the reason for this judgment to come on Israel is because they've gone after other gods and they've gone after the ways of the other nations. Because here's the reality. If you put the priorities of the world first, then it won't be long and you'll be doing the practices of the world. And so because they put the gods of the nations up there, then they began to do the practices of the nations. They began to do what they said. But that's not the only problem. Those are the causes, gods of the nations and following the nations. But it's worse than that, and that is because it is pervasive. You know, let's be honest, everybody in Israel is sinful. Everybody in this room is sinful. Some of you more than some of us. But everybody is sinful. The problem is, this isn't just sin. This is wickedness and a rejection of God. When the people of God sin, it grieves us and we want to be forgiven and we want to repent and get it out of our lives. But for these people, they don't want it out. They want to cling to it and hang on to it. And so the problem is not that there is wickedness in Israel. The problem is that it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Look at how he describes it, starting in verse 9. And the people of Israel, the nation, almost all of them, did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtowers to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars in Asherim. Asherah is the Baal deity's consort. They built these pillars and these idols to Asherah on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols of which the Lord had said to them, you will not do this. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. But they were stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves, Dan and Bethel and Jeroboam. They made an Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. And they burned their sons and daughters as offerings and used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. See, there are always evil people in every nation. That's not why a nation suffers the justice and the judgment of God. It's because of the pervasiveness of evil. Let me see if I can show you this by the most popular catastrophic judgment in the Bible that we see on a nation, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom has evil people. God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I'm going to wipe them out because they're so wicked. And Abraham says, now wait a minute, would you destroy righteous people along with the wicked? If I can find 50 people, 50, would you spare the city? God said yes. And Abraham begins to negotiate with God. Now this is a bold man. I'm not too keen on negotiating with God. God doesn't have his listed price, but his real price. What God says, that's sort of the end of it. Like I don't really like, I love to haggle, but not with God. But Abraham's going to say, well, no, wait a minute. What if there's 40? God says, okay, I'll spare the city. So Abraham says, how about 30? God says, okay, for 30. Abraham gets him down to 10. And then at 10, God says, that's it, 10. Now, Abraham's nephew, Lot, lives in the city of Sodom. And if Lot and his wife, and his kids, and their spouses, and the two daughters who lived at home, if all of them are righteous followers of the Lord, Abraham's got it. But that's not the case. It's not the case with his family at all. Abraham shows up, starts going from door to door, talking to people. Tell me about your life. Looking, he can't find anyone righteous. Sodom is not destroyed because there are wicked people there. Sodom is destroyed because Abraham can't come up with any righteous folks. The righteous are like salt. It doesn't take a lot of salt to preserve the meat, but if there's not enough salt, it will spoil. And the righteous are like salt that preserve a nation. And so the problem in Israel is not the presence of wickedness. The problem is that in a nation composed of God's people, there aren't very many righteous. There are not enough righteous to spare them. That's kind of frightening when you think about it. And so the anger of God comes on them. The judgment of God comes because the wickedness of following these idols and following these foreign nations is pervasive. It is everywhere. Look at what verse 18 says. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. But Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. Now when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. We've already talked about that. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. Now until this day, probably the days of Jeremiah. So in the early 500s BC, 595, right around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, because Jeremiah is the presumed author of 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, I want you to go back to verse 18. The Lord was very angry. I don't know about you, but I don't want to ever hear God say, I've had enough of you. I've had enough of you. The judgment of God is unbelievable. It's unfathomable. Last summer, I had the opportunity to float down the Colorado River to the Grand Canyon. And at one of the stops, I'm standing there on the bank, and I'm looking up, and it's a mile of rock from the river all the way up to the rim. But all of that rock is sedimentary rock, meaning it was deposited there by water, a mile thick. And I was standing there, and it's one of those kind of, unexpected revelation moments where it leads to worship and fear kind of all rolled in together. And I'm standing there looking at it, I'm thinking, God sent a flood because he told the world he had had enough of their wickedness, and we were down to just 8 righteous people left. Noah and Mrs. Noah and their sons and their wives, that's it. And God's judgment came. And the force was so powerful that it ripped all the topsoil off, ripped much of the bedrock off that was below that, churned it up into the water, and then around the entire globe deposited oftentimes a mile deep. It's not just the Grand Canyon we find it all over the world, and basically the same sedimentary layers. The reason we know so much about it is because we see where it was carved out, the Grand Canyon, due to what's called a dam breach, meaning there's a natural dam and the water backs up behind it, and eventually pressure enough to breach the dam, and the water would have just carved out the canyon in a couple of days. That's how canyons are formed, not over long periods of time. We've actually seen them formed, sometimes in a matter of hours. I'm standing there, I'm looking up at a mile of rock that is a result of the judgment of God. And this thought went through my mind: don't ever make God angry. And it was just one of those real kind of, I've studied the Bible my whole life, and the flood, and you have the flood, and most of the time we talk about the ark and the animals they went on by twosies, and you know the song. And elephants and kangaroosies. If you got kids, you need to learn this song. And if you don't have kids, you should learn it. Or if your kids are grown, you should learn it. But I'm standing there, I'm just like, it was just a bold visual impact to me of when God says he's had enough. You do not want to be in the way. And so this judgment comes because God has had enough. He's had enough. And so he's angry and he wipes them out. So beginning verse 24, now we're going to see some consequences of this judgment from God. And at 24, all the way to the end of the chapter, it's pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just going to read through it, and then I'll just note one or two things. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Avah, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them. And behold, they are killing them because they do not know the law of the God of the land. They believed that the gods were territorial. So verse 27, then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there. Let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashimah. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. The Severites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, that's a husband and wife, or twins, male and female deities, the gods of Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but also feared their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they've been carried away. To this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, you will not fear other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them. But you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm. You will bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. The statutes and the rules and the law and the commandment that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods, and you shall not forget the covenant that I have made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies, including the Assyrians. However, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. So these nations feared the Lord and also served the carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. So first of all, let's talk about what in the world has happened. Okay, so we've defeated Samaria, the capital of the northern 10 tribes, and we've sent a bunch of the people away. Well, now we've sent a bunch of people away. We need to repopulate the land, so we bring people from other places. Okay, so let's see if I can show you the way that this works. So I'm the king of Assyria, and these two sections, y'all all are part of the 10 northern tribes. Now, I go through and I pick out any troublemakers that I can find. And I ship y'all out over there to other places that I've conquered. But now these two sections are pretty empty. So I'm going to get some people from those places I conquered and bring them in. Because if you have people from different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds, it's hard for them to get together and to group together and to try to revolt and rebel. So this was the Assyrian plan for when they conquered a nation. So these people have now moved in. So some of y'all are still here, part of the original 10 tribes, and some of you are gone, but some other people come in. And so now you begin to intermarry with them. So now what we have are people who were told they need to fear the Lord, part of the 10 tribes, and people that brought their other gods with them. And so they kind of, when they intermarry, just kind of do them all together. Okay, they're serving other gods and these gods. Now here's what's fascinating. Later in history, the Jews, people from the tribe of Judah, said those are not pure Hebrews because they've intermarried. They became known as Samaritans. So when you read about Samaritans in the New Testament, and they were despised by the Jews, it goes all the way back to 722 BC. History has an impact for a long, long time. Matter of fact, they so despised the Samaritans that they had to walk through Samaria. When they got to the border of Judah, they would shake all of the dust off their feet because you can't take that dirty dirt, that unclean dirt, onto God's dirt. That's how much they hated and despised them. So this idea of the Samaritans, that's where it comes from right here. The other thing to note is, in some ways, you read this chapter, you go, how many times do you have to say they served other gods? We get it. I could take this entire chapter and put it in one verse. They served other gods, they followed other nations, so God brought judgment. That's what happened. But that's not nearly as impactful as saying it over and over and over again. Because the problem is not that they served other gods at some point somewhere. The problem is they just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. They never listen to the warnings that God has sent. They never listen to them. They never wake up to them. And so here's basically what God is saying. There's a leak in your house, and trying to paint over the mold isn't what you need to do. You need to fix the leak. And in your life, you can paint over stuff, and other people might see it and think it's okay, but the reality is if your heart's not right, you got a problem. Your heart is what needs to be fixed. And only Jesus Christ can fix it. Only Jesus Christ can make it happen. Now, I am a student of history. And I do not think the history is boring. What's crazy is that people don't learn from it. People don't learn. They didn't learn from history. They didn't learn from what had happened to others. You say, well, what about the southern kingdom? They probably learned from watching the northern kingdom destroyed. Nope. They continued to sin, and in 586, God wiped them out as well. It's stunning how we don't learn from history. We don't learn the necessity of the presence of the righteous. I mean, let's face it, Israel never thought they'd be destroyed. The God that brought them out of Egypt would always deliver them in the end. Nope. No one ever thought the Roman Empire would fall, but it did. No one ever thought the Khan dynasty could ever be overthrown, but it was. And let me tell you, there is no guarantee that the United States will continue to exist. Our survival depends not on what Washington does. Look, if it depended on Washington, we'd been gone a long time ago. It depends on the presence of the righteous. Our nation has always had sin, and it always will. Our churches have always had sin, and they always will. But the reality is, how do we respond to that? In repentance and pleading for God's mercy and grace, or in defiance of God? And when you see evil begin to pervade every area of society, don't think that justice and judgment are not coming. Now, let's just realize that we don't think it's going to happen because we don't see it happen. Because God is very patient, and for that we are quite thankful. If God was not patient, none of us would be here. 922 to 722, for 200 years God has warned them. 200 years before God's judgment falls. And then we're going to get about another 150 years before the southern kingdom judgment will fall. Do not mistake God's patience for God doesn't care. Do not mistake God's grace for God will never let it happen. Don't mistake God's goodness for God will never judge. It does not work that way. When God has had enough, it is a terrible thing to face. It is a terrible thing to stand before a righteous and a holy God. Do not think that there is any guarantee. Because what did Israel do? They turned to the world's power. They went to Egypt. And that was not enough to stop the Assyrians. I don't know if you caught it in here, but he said, they did not trust the Lord who brought them out of Egypt to deliver them from all wickedness. They would have been delivered from the Assyrians if they would have trusted in God. instead of the gods of the nations, the ways of the nations, and the power of Egypt. You and I don't need to trust in the power of this world. We don't need to follow the ways of this world or the priorities of this world. Our priority needs to be Jesus Christ. That's our priority. That's what needs to be fixed, the heart, and that Jesus is number one. And listen, Jesus is not number one plus some others. Jesus is not just sort of like a little higher among the pile. Jesus wants to be exclusive, number one, our priority. The problem in this passage is they have moved their priorities elsewhere. Listen, here's what Jesus said. You cannot serve God and money. Even Jesus said you cannot have competing priorities in your life. He needs to be the only, the ultimate, the prime, the supreme priority in your life and in my life. And the sad thing is, this was, y'all ready to do the math? 2,000. If it's 722 BC and we're at 2023, 2,745 years ago. That's a long time. Let's just round it off for those of you that struggle. 2,700 years ago. And in 2,700 years, people still have not learned. God is patient, but one of these days, He'll have enough. One of these days, He'll have enough. Here's the way it's going to work. You can reject God and rebel against Him for a lifetime. For your entire life. You can refuse His commandments, His covenants, His laws, His rules, and all of that we read about here. You can reject them. But then the judgment's coming. Without Jesus by your side at the judgment, when the sentence is passed, it is catastrophic. It is eternal separation from God forever in a place called hell. But when you stand before the judgment and Jesus is by your side, He will see you through to the other side. And He will take you to be with Him in heaven forever. Not because you're awesome, but because you're forgiven. We need to learn from history that God is going to bring judgment. And it is horrible, and it is severe, and it's catastrophic because He is that kind of power and that kind of pureness. But there is a way out, and it's through Jesus. Forgiveness of Him, because of that, He is our number one priority. Our Heavenly Father, we see, even you warn them in this passage, hey, look, you didn't listen to me. I sent warning after warning after warning. They've seen it, they've heard it, and yet they don't respond to it correctly. They don't fix the real problem. They don't look for you to change their heart. And so, God, as we look through history, not just the Bible, but throughout all of mankind's history, we see the same thing, a refusal, a rejection of your truth. And that the day comes when there's so much evil and so little righteousness that your judgment falls. But Father, we thank you that in our own lives, in Jesus Christ, we can get through the judgment. That the penalty will not be laid on us, but laid instead on your Son, Jesus Christ. That we can have total forgiveness and everlasting life. God, I pray that you would help us to learn our lesson from those that have gone before us. Let us heed the warning. Let us make Jesus not a priority, but the only priority in our lives. For it is in His name that we pray. Amen.